I was born into the vats, though no record says so plainly. The register notes a date, a shift bell, a batch designation, and a checksum of witnesses who no longer breathe. It does not say that the air was already thick with steam when I drew my first breath, or that the smell of rendered fat and sanctified oil seeped into my lungs before I learned to cry. It does not say that the cathedral spires above the manufactorum never slept, their bells tolling hours that were not meant for children. It does not say that the first thing I learned to recognize was heat. They recorded my name once. I remember the sound of it, though the syllables have thinned with time, like wax stretched too far by flame. The clerk spoke it without looking at me, stylus scratching across parchment already stained by 1,000 other lives. Then the slate clicked, the name vanished into an archive, and I was issued a work code stamped into my ration chit with a dull iron press. That code followed me everywhere, a small rectangle of metal that clinked softly when I walked, as if reminding me that I was counted, measured, owned. Each day began with prayer, not the kind meant to comfort, but the kind meant to align. We stood in rows on the manufactorum floor, boots slick with old tallow, hands clasped while a priest recited litanies of illumination from a raised pulpit bolted to the wall. His voice echoed off stone and steel, magnified by vox grills that crackled with age. He spoke of light as obedience made visible, of flame as proof that sacrifice had meaning. Above us, stained, glass panels filtered the shrine's eternal glow into bands of color that cut through the steam like knives. They were beautiful. I believed they were watching us. Then the bells rang, and belief became labor. The vats dominated the hall, vast iron cauldrons set into the floor, each one rimmed with brass scripture plates etched so deeply the letters caught grease in their grooves. Inside, the wax mixture churned slowly, stirred by augmetic paddles that groaned with every rotation. The surface shimmered, a skin of molten yellow, white broken by bubbles that burst with wet, meaty sounds. Sacred oils were poured in measured amounts, each vial blessed, each drop recorded. Rendered fat arrived in sealed drums, stamped with origin codes I learned not to read too closely. My station was along the stirring line. A long-handled paddle, its grip worn smooth by generations of palms, waited for me each shift. I would take it up, feel the vibration travel up my arms as the mechanism engaged, and begin the slow, circular motion that kept the mixture from separating. The heat pressed against my face and chest, relentless, making sweat run down my spine until my clothes stuck to me. My hands ached within the first hour, fingers cramping, shoulders burning, but stopping was not permitted. Stoppage introduced inconsistency. Inconsistency was impurity. Priests walked the aisles as we worked, robes trailing dangerously close to open vats, censers swinging from chains that hissed when ash fell into the wax. They preached while we stirred. They told us that every candle mattered, that each votive flame carried a fragment of devotion upward, through the shrine's vaulted ceilings, into the emperor's gaze. They told us that the light we made pushed back darkness somewhere far away, on battlefields we would never see. I believed them. Belief was easier than doubt, and doubt had a way of being noticed. The stink clung to everything. Tallow has a sweetness to it when it first melts, but it curdles quickly, thickening into something that coats the back of the throat. Incense was meant to mask it, but only succeeded in layering perfume over rot. By the end of a shift, the smell lived in my hair, my skin, the creases of my hands. I could scrub until my knuckles bled and still catch it on my breath when I exhaled. It followed me into sleep and into dreams I did not yet know how to interpret. We worked by quotas. Numbers posted on a slate at the start of each cycle, adjusted by festival calendars and pilgrimage projections. The overseer, a broad man with a shock maul slung casually at his hip, walked behind us, tapping the slate with a stylus, counting output with a detached expression. He rarely spoke. When he did, it was to correct posture or pace. His corrections were gentle at first, a hand on the shoulder, a murmured warning about efficiency. Later, when I was older, I would see him use them all. In those early days, I told myself that diligence would spare me. At break, if the quota curve permitted one, we were issued ration wafers and tepid water. We ate standing backs to the wall, careful not to drip crumbs into the wax. Conversation was discouraged. Sound carried oddly in the hall, swallowed by steam or flung back amplified by stone. I learned the rhythm of the place instead, the churn of paddles, the hiss of censers, the distant bells marking hours I could not spend elsewhere. At night, when the shift ended, I would climb the narrow stairs to the hab, levels above the manufactorum. The shrine world never truly darkened. Light spilled from windows and lanterns and candles by the million, a constant glow that turned the sky a permanent amber. I would stand sometimes at the railing and look out over the city, watching pilgrims move like ants along processional roads, their faces uplifted towards spires I could not see the tops of. I told myself that some of the light guiding them came from my hands. My hands were already changing. The skin thickened, calluses blooming where the paddle rubbed. Small burns speckled my forearms, wax splashes that blistered and healed into shiny scars. I wore them like marks of pride, proof of service. Proof that I belonged to something vast and holy. I did not yet understand that belonging could be a kind of erasure. The ledger in the overseer's office listed us by code, not by name. I saw it once when I was sent to fetch a seal roll. Long columns of alphanumerics, quotas met or missed marked in red ink. My code was there, neat and impersonal. I remember feeling a strange satisfaction at that, at being reduced to something that fit so cleanly on a page. Names were messy. Codes burned evenly. When the bells tolled the end of the cycle and the final prayers were spoken, I would kneel with the others, knees aching on cold stone, and repeat the words until they lost meaning and became sound. The priest would raise a candle, fresh, perfect, its wick centered exactly, and bless it. The flame would catch, steady and bright, and for a moment the heat on my face felt like approval. I did not know then that the stink would never leave me, that the light would demand more than my hours and my hands, that the vats were only the beginning. I believed, because belief was the first thing they taught us to make. They taught me the wick before they trusted me with the mold. In the manufactorum catechism, wax is body and wick is spine. Without it, the candle collapses into useless softness, a melted offering with no direction. The priests said the wick was the part that remembered the flame, the narrow path that guided heat upward like prayer. They said the wick carried intention. They said intention could be measured. I was reassigned from stirring to the wick house on my 12th standard year, not because I had earned promotion, but because my arms were strong enough to keep pace and my eyes still had some sharpness left in them. The wick house sat beneath a smaller chapel annex, where the ceilings were lower and the air felt closer, as if the building itself leaned in to listen. The smell changed there, less fat, more dust and hair and old cloth dampened by sanctified water. It was not better, only different, like the stink of a graveyard compared to a slaughterhouse. The overseer in the wick house wore a different kind of authority. He did not carry a maul. He carried a measuring rod and a ledger, and he used both with the same calm cruelty. His hands were clean in a way that made me uneasy. Clean hands meant you did not touch the raw truth of things. You only touched the paperwork that justified it. Consistency, he told me on my first shift, pressing a bundle of raw fiber into my palms. The bundle was gray, matted, and faintly sticky. As holiness made visible, inconsistency is sin made measurable. He said it like scripture, and I nodded like a child eager to please. Then he pulled my hands closer to my face and forced my fingers to separate the fibers. Feel that, he said. That's devotion. The fibers were corpse fiber, stripped from the dead and processed until it resembled thread. It had a texture like dried skin, too smooth in places, too rough in others. Some strands snapped with a brittle sound when I pulled them. The work required patience, a steady pressure, a sensitivity in the fingertips. It was a craft, they said, a sacred one. They did not mention where the corpse fiber came from. You learned that by smell. The penitent's hair came in sacks. Coarse black, pale blonde, gray, sometimes still clumped with scalp oil and devotional ash. Each sack was stamped with a tithe code and a parish seal, each one accompanied by a parchment certifying that the donor had offered it willingly. I learned quickly that willingly was an elastic word in holy administration. The hair was rinsed in sanctified water, then combed, then laid out to dry beneath heat lamps that hummed like insects. The lamps gave the hair a faint smell of burning, a reminder that even purity could be scorched into compliance. The braiding tables were long and narrow, lined with rows of workers hunched like penitents themselves. We sat shoulder to shoulder, heads bent, fingers moving in synchronized rhythm. The only sound was the soft rasp of fiber against fiber and the scratch of styluses as scribes recorded output. Above us, devotional icons watched with painted eyes that never blinked. Below us, the floor was littered with stray strands swept into corners like forgotten prayers. Each wick had to meet a standard thickness measured in fractions, length cut precisely, braid tension uniform. The overseer carried his measuring rod like a weapon. He would stop behind a worker, pluck a finished wick from their tray, and hold it up to the lumen light. If it was too loose, too tight, too uneven, he would mark the worker's code in red. Red meant review. Review meant punishment. They tested our wicks in the flame alcove at the end of each shift. A small stone chamber with an iron grate and a brass altar, blackened by years of smoke. The priests called it the sanctum of trial. To me, it looked like an execution room for thread. We would file in with our trays, kneel, and hand our wicks to the test adept, who would feed them into small wax pillars and light them one by one. We watched the flames closely. Not with awe, but with fear. A good wick burned steady, drawing wax upward in a clean, controlled ascent. The flame would sit tall and bright, without sputter or lean. The test adept would nod, mark the batch as acceptable, and move on. A bad wick betrayed you. It sputtered, it smoked. It leaned sideways, dripping soot onto the altar stone like a stain. Sometimes it burned too quickly, consuming itself in a rush, leaving the wax pillar to slump. Sometimes it burned too slowly, the flame choking, as if refusing to rise. Each failure was logged. Each failure was traced. The overseer would examine the batch code, then the worker codes assigned to that table. He would make a note in his ledger with the same calm he used to record production totals. Then he would choose someone. The first beating I saw was for a wick that flared too hot. The worker, a thin man with hollow cheeks and a devotional tattoo half faded on his neck, insisted it wasn't his fault. He swore he had braided with proper tension, that he had followed the rites. His voice shook with desperation, and the desperation itself sounded like sin. The overseer listened. Then he gestured to the enforcers. They did not drag the man away. They beat him right there, beside the flame alcove, so the rest of us could learn. The shock, baton cracked against bone with a wet, dull sound. The man's mouth opened, but the chapel annex swallowed his screams beneath hymns. A priest began to chant about mercy as the baton fell again and again. I remember the smell most, singed hair from the flame tests mingling with the sharp tang of blood. Devotion rendered into scent. Afterward, the priest placed a hand on the beaten man's head and murmured absolution. The overseer marked the ledger in black ink this time. Black meant correction applied. Case closed. We returned to our tables. Our fingers moved faster, trembling only slightly. I told myself it was justice. I told myself the Imperium could not afford waste, that a flawed wick might doom a shrine candle somewhere important, might offend the Emperor, might invite darkness. These were the excuses they handed us, and I clutched them like warmth. But something inside me began to gutter. It started small. A flicker of doubt when I watched the flame tests and realized how arbitrary they were. How a draft through the alcove door could make a good wick seem bad. How a drop of oil in the wax could change burn time and doom a worker to punishment. Holiness, I began to suspect, was not always measured fairly. That suspicion felt dangerous, like stepping off a marked path, so I turned it inward. If the system was perfect, then the fault must be mine. My braid tension, my focus, my devotion. I prayed harder before my shifts, whispering litanies into my knuckles as I worked. I kept my eyes down. I counted strands like rosary beads. I thought of obedience as a kind of armor, and I wrapped myself in it until I could breathe again. The wicks we produced were catalogued and blessed in a final rite before they were sent to the molding hall. Each bundle was tied with a strip of parchment bearing seals and scripture lines, then placed in crates stamped with destination codes, cathedrals, battlefield chapels, funeral barges, distant hive shrines. The overseer would press his seal into the wax stamp on the crate lid and declare it sanctified. I watched those crates leave and imagined them as light traveling outward, carried on the backs of laborers and servitors, bound for places I would never see. I imagined the candles burning in grand basilicas, their flames steady because my fingers had been steady. I tried to take pride in that. Yet every time I saw a worker beaten, every time I watched the priest chant mercy over bruised flesh, the flame in my chest felt smaller. Not extinguished, never that. Not yet, but dimmed, as if someone had placed a glass over it and starved it of air. I learned to braid in silence. I learned to keep my face blank during the tests. I learned that obedience and holiness looked identical from a distance. And when my own wicks burned steady, I told myself that was proof I was still worthy. Proof that whatever doubts flickered inside me were only smoke, and smoke could be choked down if you held your breath long enough. Pilgrim season did not begin with an announcement. It arrived like rot, quiet at first, then all at once, impossible to ignore once the smell set in. The bells rang longer during those cycles, their tolling stretched and layered until the sound seemed to overlap itself. Processional roads clogged with bodies wrapped in rags and prayer scrolls, their feet bleeding through cracked sandals as they pressed toward the shrine gates. From the manufactorum vents we could hear them, sometimes thousands of voices, chanting in a rhythmic unison, coughing between verses, begging for light. The priests said their devotion strengthened the world's sanctity. The overseers said it increased demand. Inside the candle halls, quotas tripled overnight. The ledger was updated without ceremony. New numbers, new expectations, stamped and sealed before any of us could object. Break periods vanished. Sleep became a variable rather than a right, parceled out according to output curves and fatigue tolerance tables posted by the Medica clerks. We were told this was an honor, an opportunity to serve more completely. I believed them because disbelief required energy I no longer had. The dead began to arrive before the pilgrims finished arriving. Some collapsed at the gates, hearts spent after years of walking and kneeling. Others died in the crowd, crushed under the weight of faith pressing forward. Their bodies were collected by servitors and penitents, tagged with origin codes, and sent down to us through the processing chutes. The priests called it reclamation. Nothing devoted was wasted. I was reassigned again, temporarily, they said, to the rendering floor. The vats there were deeper than the wax vats, their rims scarred by decades of contact with bone and metal hooks. The air was thicker, wetter, heavy with the smell of boiled flesh. Steam rose constantly, clinging to skin and hair until everything felt perpetually damp. The heat was worse, a suffocating blanket that pressed thoughts flat. Above us, devotional banners hung limp, their stitched prayers darkened by grease. We worked in shifts that blurred together. Bodies were unloaded, stripped, catalogue. The flesh was separated by type, fat for tallow, bone for grind, hair for wicks if it met purity standards. Anything unusable was incinerated with brief rites and longer smoke. Each step had a form, each form had a signature, each signature was checked. I learned to recognize pilgrims by fragments. A hand still clutching a prayer charm worn smooth by years of rubbing. A face frozen in an expression of awe or terror, indistinguishable once the skin slackened. Sometimes a tattoo, an aquila, a verse, a crude depiction of a shrine spire, half melted by the heat of processing. We were told not to look too closely. Familiarity bred hesitation. I failed at that instruction early. One body came through wearing a threadbare cloak, stitched with pilgrimage tallies, each line marking a year spent traveling. I recognized the pattern because I had seen it outside the manufactorum windows only days earlier, when the pilgrim had looked up at the spires with tears on his cheeks. Recognition hit me like a physical blow. My hands froze. The overseer noticed immediately. "Do not pause," he said, voice flat. "Devotion does not excuse inefficiency." I moved. The body slid into the vat, the surface bubbled, the face vanished beneath the churn. After that, I learned how to keep my eyes unfocused. The chants grew louder as the season wore on. Pilgrims filled every square inch of the shrine plazas, lighting candles by the tens of thousands. Each flame was a demand placed upon us, a silent order to produce more light, more proof of devotion. The priests praised the glow from their pulpits, extolling the world's sanctity, never mentioning the cost measured in bodies and hours. We slept in snatches, 20 minutes here, an hour there, on cots set up in the corridors between shifts. The smell followed us even into unconsciousness. Dreams, when they came, were thick with smoke and wax, with bells tolling endlessly overhead. I woke more than once with my hands curled as if still gripping tools. Speech became inefficient. We stopped talking except when required by protocol. Communication reduced itself to gestures, nods, the passing of tools. I began thinking in measures: vat capacity, burn yield, quota deficit, faces blurred, time fractured into shifts and tallies, and still, demand rose. The ledger glowed red with urgency marks. Emergency requisitions poured in from off-world shrines, from battlefield chapels, from places where faith burned as fast as men died. The shrine world's administrators preened at the numbers, at the increased tithe value. The world shone brighter than ever. We grew dimmer. One cycle. A cart overturned during unloading, spilling bodies across the floor. The impact cracked skulls already brittle from processing heat. Ash and fragments scattered. For a moment, no one moved. The scene felt obscene even by our standards, devotion reduced to debris. Then the overseer barked an order, and we cleaned it up. Ash was swept and collected, bagged, and added to the next rendering batch. Fine particulate used to adjust wax density and color for certain ritual candles. Nothing was wasted. Even accident was repurposed. I stopped counting days sometime during the peak of the season. My hands lost feeling, nerves dulled by constant heat and repetitive motion. When I burned myself, I noticed only when the smell changed. Pain became background noise, like the bells. One night, if night is the right word when the sky never darkens, I caught my reflection in a vat's polished rim. My face looked thinner, eyes sunk deep, skin stained yellow by wax residue that never quite washed off. I barely recognized myself. The work code tag at my neck felt heavier than ever. The candles sold out daily. Pilgrims left the shrines clutching bundles of light, faces radiant with fulfillment. They believed their journey complete, their devotion rewarded. I watched them go from a grated vent, leaning on a railing slick with condensation, and felt nothing. No pride, no anger, only a hollow space where belief had once lived. The shrine world glowed brighter with every passing cycle. Spires shone, processional roads flickered like rivers of fire. Administrators issued congratulatory proclamations about increased sanctity and output efficiency. Down below, in the rendering halls, we dimmed. I learned not to pause when I recognized a face. I learned that ash could be measured like any other resource. I learned that sleep was a luxury, faith a function, and light something wrung from flesh and bone by careful hands and careful paperwork. And when the pilgrim season finally broke, leaving behind empty roads and piles of ash, the quotas did not fall. They never do. The inspectors arrived on a day that smelled wrong. I noticed it before the alarms or announcements, before the overseers straightened their backs and the priests adjusted their vestments. The air in the manufactorum shifted, losing some of its familiar rancid warmth and taking on the sharp, sterile edge of parchment and seal wax. It was the smell of judgment, of ledgers opened by hands that never touched the vats. Audits were rare, but never unexpected. We were taught to live as if we were already being examined, every motion a potential line item, every breath an entry waiting to be marked deficient. Still, when the first inspection procession entered the hall, conversation died completely. Even the machinery seemed to quiet, its groans dropping to a more respectful register. They wore ash, white robes reinforced with armored seams, their chests heavy with chains of office and purity seals layered, so thick they rustled when they moved. Each inspector carried a scroll case and a data slate, both adorned with the sigils of shrine world authority. Their faces were thin and expressionless, eyes pale from long hours under lumen light. They did not look at us as people. They looked at the work. The priests preceded them, chanting softly, as if to reassure the manufacturum's machine, spirits that this intrusion was sanctioned. Incense flared brighter, a futile attempt to drown out the omnipresent stink of fat and ash. I stood at my station, hands still, heart hammering against my ribs in a way that felt dangerously loud. Resume labor. The overseer barked, his voice too sharp. Deviation will be noted. So we worked while they watched. The inspectors began at the wick house, moving slowly, deliberately, measuring and weighing as they went. They pulled samples from trays without warning, holding them up to the light, rolling them between gloved fingers. They murmured to one another, scribes scratching notes at their heels. Occasionally, one would pause and consult a scroll, comparing a sample against a printed standard of burn, length or fiber density. Every time one of them stopped near my table, my stomach tightened. I focused on my hands on the familiar rhythm of braiding, strand over strand, pressure consistent, breathe in time. I recited fragments of prayer under my breath, not because I believed they would help, but because silence felt like an admission of guilt. When they moved on, I exhaled slowly, careful not to draw attention. The audit continued for hours. They inspected wax batches, dipping calibrated rods into vats and timing the way molten tallow clung and fell. They measured scent profiles with small auger devices, frowning when readings drifted even slightly from the ideal. Each deviation was noted. Each note felt like a nail hammered into the future. Near the end of the cycle, they reached my station again. One inspector, taller than the rest, his robe edged in red thread, picked up a finished candle from the tray assigned to my output code. It was flawless to my eye, smooth sides, even color. Wick scented with care. He held it up, rotated it slowly, then nodded to a scribe. "Test," he said. The candle was carried to the sanctum of trial. I followed at a distance with the other workers, my legs heavy. The stone chamber felt smaller than I remembered, the walls closing in. The test adept took the candle, placed it on the altar, and lit the wick with a taper flame. For a moment it burned perfectly. Then the flame leaned, not much, barely perceptible. A subtle angle, as if the candle were bowing under some unseen weight. A thin ribbon of smoke curled upward, darker than it should have been. The inspector's eyes narrowed. "Impurity," he said. The word fell into the chamber like a dropped tool, ringing long after it should have stopped. I felt it strike my chest, knocking the air from my lungs. The scribe checked the batch code. Then the worker code, mine. The inspector turned to me. His gaze was clinical, detached. "Explain," he said. My mouth opened. No words came. I searched my memory frantically. Had I rushed the braid, misjudged the wax temperature, missed a contaminant in the fiber? The system was vast, the variables endless. Any number of factors could have caused that slight lean. None of them mattered. I do not know," I said finally, my voice barely audible over the hum of the lumen globes. The inspector nodded, as if that were the expected answer. "Ignorance does not negate culpability," he said. "Record the confession." A scribe stepped forward, slate already active. The overseer placed a heavy hand on my shoulder, forcing me to kneel. "Confess," he hissed under his breath. "Make it clean." So I did. I confessed to negligence I did not understand, to lapses in focus, to insufficient devotion. The words spilled out in the approved format, phrases I had heard others use, phrases that always seemed to satisfy the auditors. As I spoke, the scribe's stylus moved steadily, translating my shame into neat lines of text. When I finished, the inspector affixed his seal to the slate with a sharp press. "Penance assigned," he said. "Extended labor hours, ration reduction, monitoring intensified. No anger, no triumph, just process. They did not beat me. That would have been too visible, too crude. Instead, they adjusted my schedule. My rest allotment shrank. My ration chit was stamped with a reduction code that shaved off precious calories. A red mark appeared next to my work, code in the ledger, under review. The inspectors moved on. I returned to my station, hands trembling, and resumed braiding as if nothing had happened. Around me, no one met my eyes. They knew better. Association with impurity was dangerous. The fires burned on, indifferent. Over the next cycles, the effects of penance accumulated quietly. Hunger gnawed at me, a constant ache that made concentration harder, which only deepened my shame. Longer shifts blurred my thoughts, making mistakes more likely, or at least making me feel more likely to make them. Overseers watched me more closely, their gazes lingering. I began to fear the ledgers more than the vats. Fire was honest. It burned or it did not. Wax melted, flesh rendered. There was brutality in that, but also simplicity. The ledgers were different. They remembered. They accumulated. A single red mark could follow you for years, resurfacing in audits, justifying harsher correction each time. At night, when I lay on my cot too hungry to sleep, I imagined my work code glowing red in some distant archive, a flaw noted and never erased. I imagined inspectors flipping through pages, my confession one line among millions, enough to condemn me if ever they needed justification. I prayed then, not for forgiveness, but for invisibility. When the audit finally ended and the inspectors departed, the manufacturer exhaled as one. But the relief was shallow. We knew better now. The standards had been reaffirmed. The margin for error had shrunk, and somewhere in the ledgers, my impurity had been made permanent. I went back to work knowing that the next judgment would not need an inspector to arrive. It was already written. Festival night was meant to be merciful. That was what the priests said as the shrine world prepared itself, as banners were unfurled and bells rang in layered harmonies meant to stir awe instead of dread. The manufacturer ran at maximum output for 3 full cycles beforehand, vats never cooling, wicks braided until fingers bled and numbness replaced pain. Festival candles were special, larger, thicker, infused with higher concentrations of sacred oils, so their flames would burn bright and long enough to impress the pilgrims and reassure distant authorities that this world remained pure. We were told it was an honor to contribute. By then, my penance was already grinding me down. Longer shifts had hollowed me out, and the ration reduction gnawed constantly, a dull ache behind every thought. Hunger makes everything feel like judgment. Every glance from an overseer felt heavier, every whispered correction sharper. I worked more carefully than ever, terrified of another mark in the ledger, terrified of being seen. The festival batch was assigned to multiple stations, mine among them. I remember the candles when they came off the molds, smooth, pale, almost beautiful. Their surfaces caught the lumen light and reflected it softly, like bone polished by years of handling. The wicks sat centered and straight. By all visible measures, they were flawless. I allowed myself a dangerous thought, that perhaps I had redeemed myself, that my earlier impurity would be balanced by this contribution. The thought itself felt like a sin. The night of the festival, we were permitted, ordered, to stand at the edges of the main shrine hall and observe. Observation was part of devotion, the priest said. We needed to see the fruit of our labor to understand its importance. So we stood in our work, stained uniforms beneath vaulted ceilings lost in smoke, watching pilgrims pack the space until there was barely room to breathe. The air shimmered with heat and incense. Choirs sang from hidden galleries, their voices amplified and distorted until they sounded like something other than human. The walls were lined with alcoves, each holding rows upon rows of our candles, unlit for now, waiting. When the high priest raised his staff, the hall fell silent. Let there be light, he intoned. Flames blossomed. Thousands of candles were lit in cascading waves, altar to alcove, easel to easel. For a heartbeat, the sight was breathtaking. The hall glowed gold and white, shadows fleeing before the sudden brilliance. The pilgrims wept openly, faces uplifted, hands trembling as they reached toward the light. Then the flames began to change. At first, it was subtle, a collective flicker that rippled through the rows like a shiver. I felt it more than saw it, a tightening in my chest, as if something had gone wrong deep inside the system. The heat intensified too quickly. Wax began to soften, then drip. The candles burned too fast. Thick rivulets of molten wax ran down their sides, pooling on the shrine floor in glossy puddles that reflected the light like tears. Some flames flared high, licking dangerously close to banners and robes. Smoke thickened, dark and acrid, stinging eyes and throats. A murmur spread through the crowd. The priests tried to continue, voices rising to cover the growing unease, but the visual language of failure was impossible to ignore. Candles guttered, some collapsing entirely, their wicks drowning in their own excess. What should have been steady devotion became frantic flicker, an omen. That was the word that moved through the hall, whispered and then spoken aloud. I heard it from a pilgrim near me, her voice cracking. I heard it from a junior priest whose training could not mask his fear. I felt it settle over us like ash. The high priest raised his staff again, but this time the gesture lacked confidence. He spoke quickly, offering reassurances, reframing the failure as a test, a challenge to collective faith. But the damage was done. Light, which was meant to sanctify, had instead judged. The overseers herded us back to the manufactorum under heavy guard. No one spoke during the march. The bells tolled again, but now they sounded accusatory, each chime a count of error. In the main hall, We were assembled in rows beneath the same spires that had once inspired me. They felt closer now, pressing down. The priests stood above us. The inspectors had returned with alarming speed, their ash-white robes stark against the smoke-stained stone. The ledgers were already open. This failure, the high priest said, voice echoing, is not random. The light does not err without cause. I felt cold despite the heat. They spoke of impurity, of hidden sin, of labor performed without sufficient devotion. They spoke of the need for accountability, for visible correction to reassure the faithful that the shrine world took such signs seriously. As they spoke, scribes moved through the ranks, checking work codes against batch assignments. Names codes were read aloud, each one struck like a hammer blow. When a code was called, the worker stepped forward, face pale, eyes downcast. Some shook, some stared blankly ahead, already gone somewhere safer in their minds. When my code was read, I felt a strange calm. I stepped forward as instructed, my legs moving with mechanical obedience. The heat of the candles still clung to my skin, and the smell of burnt wax filled my nostrils. I understood, in that moment, that my earlier impurity had not been forgiven. It had merely waited. You, the inspector said, pointing with a gloved hand, your station contributed to this batch. Yes, I said. The word felt inevitable. The high priest leaned forward. Do you deny responsibility? Denial would have been pointless. The ledger already knew the answer. No, I said. A murmur rippled through the assembled workers. Acceptance was expected. It made the process smoother. Punishment was pronounced in ritual language, framed as purification rather than reprisal. Reassignment, further penance, reduced status. The words blurred together, their meaning sinking in only slowly. I was being marked, set apart as an example. As the priests concluded, the flames from the failed candles were extinguished one by one, plunging sections of the hall into shadow. The remaining light felt harsher by contrast, less forgiving. I realized then that light did not merely illuminate. It exposed, it judged, it demanded payment. When we were dismissed, the pilgrims were already gone, ushered out with careful reassurances and replacement candles drawn from emergency reserves. The shrine world would recover its image. It always did. We returned to our stations knowing that the cost of that recovery would be extracted from us. That night, as I lay on my cot, stomach empty, body aching, I understood something I had avoided for too long. Holiness was not a shield. It was a lens, and through it, our smallest failures were magnified until they justified anything done to us. The flames had judged, and they had found me wanting. They sent me down. That was how the reassignment was phrased in the ledger transfer approved. Subject reassigned to lower processing. No ceremony, no audience. Just a stamped directive affixed to my ration slate and a brief nod from the overseer, as if he were handing me a tool instead of a sentence. Down meant beneath the levels pilgrims ever imagined existed, beneath the halls where incense still pretended to mask decay. Down was where the shrine world hid the cost of its light. The descent took longer than I expected. Stair after stair spiraled into the manufactorum's underbody, each level marked by faded devotional plaques and warning sigils about heat, contamination, and faith. The air grew thicker with every step, heavy with rot and old prayers spoken so often they had lost their meaning. The bells were faint here, distant and distorted, as if even sound struggled to reach this depth. The lower vats were ancient. They were older than the spires above, older than the current doctrines, perhaps older than the shrine world itself. Their iron walls were pitted and scarred, patched repeatedly with welded plates etched in cramped scripture. The heat was constant and oppressive, not the active burn of the upper halls, but a suffocating, stagnant warmth that pressed against skin and lungs alike. Steam rose in sluggish columns, carrying with it the smell of decay so deep it bypassed disgust and went straight to nausea. This was where the dead came last. Bodies arrived in bulk, not tagged with care but dumped by the cartload, their identities already reduced to numbers in transit logs. Some were pilgrims who had never made it back to the surface. Others were workers, men and women whose quotas had finally exceeded their bodies' tolerance. Here, the distinction did not matter. Flesh was flesh, yield was yield. My hands were assigned new tools, hooked poles for guiding bodies into the vats, long knives for separating usable tissue from waste, scoops for skimming impurities from the surface. The tools were heavy, their handles slick with residue that never fully cleaned off. Gloves were issued, but they degraded quickly, eaten away by heat and chemical sanctifiers until bare skin was exposed again. No one spoke. There was no need. Orders were posted on slates bolted to the walls, updated automatically with quotas and processing targets. Overseers watched from raised walkways, their silhouettes dark against the steam, their attention fixed on output numbers rather than individual movement. Correction came swiftly and without explanation, an extra shift added, a ration docked, a rest period removed. I worked until my arms trembled, then worked until the trembling stopped, because there was nothing left to shake. The dead arrived faster than we could process them. Carts backed up along the access tunnels, waiting their turn. When capacity was exceeded, bodies were stacked along the walls on metal racks, their skin gray and waxy in the heat. The sight should have horrified me. Instead, it became background, another element of the environment like steam or noise. I stopped thinking in words, thought became calculation. How many bodies per vat? How long until saturation? How much fat rendered per cycle? Faith, once a thing of symbols and stories, became a function, a justification appended to numbers. The priests rarely came this far down, but when they did, they spoke the same sermons, their voices echoing hollowly against iron. This labor is sacred, they said, stepping carefully around pools of runoff. Endurance is devotion made visible. I nodded because that was expected. Inside, the words slid off me like grease. Sleep became something that happened to other people. When I did rest, it was on a cot bolted to the wall, the metal vibrating with the churn of the vats beside me. Dreams, when they came, were fragmented and brief, images of endless corridors, of flames that never went out, of hands reaching from molten surfaces and sinking back without sound. My hands lost all feeling. At first, numbness was a blessing. Burns no longer startled me. Cuts went unnoticed until I saw blood mixing with wax and runoff. Later, the lack of sensation became frightening in its own way. I would look down and see my fingers moving without any sense of connection, like tools operated by someone else. Once, a body slipped from my hook and fell awkwardly, splashing hot residue up my arm. The skin blistered instantly. I watched it happen with detached interest, noting the color change, the way the flesh tightened. I reported the injury because protocol required it, then returned to work. The candles burned across the world. We were shown picked feeds occasionally, approved morale material, the overseers called it. Images of distant shrines glowing with light, of battlefield altars surrounded by kneeling soldiers, of processions winding through cities lit by our candles. The implication was clear: our suffering had meaning, because it was distant. I felt nothing watching them. The work did not end when my shift was supposed to. The slate simply updated with a revised schedule, extending labor by hours, sometimes days. Fatigue was logged, not relieved. When someone collapsed, their body was removed efficiently, their work code struck from the active roster and added to intake logs. The system adjusted and continued. I learned to keep my eyes down, my movements steady, my mind empty. Thinking about the future invited despair. Thinking about the past invited pain. The present was easier. The present was just work. Once, during a brief maintenance halt, I found myself staring into a vat long after my task was done. The surface churned slowly, reflecting distorted fragments of the chamber lights. For a moment, I imagined myself in there, reduced, rendered, repurposed into light. The thought did not frighten me as it once would have. It felt inevitable. When the halt ended, I resumed my place without comment. Faith, by then, had lost all warmth. It was no longer a comfort or a belief. It was a requirement, like breathing filtered air or following posted quotas. I still recited prayers when prompted, my mouth forming the words automatically, but they rang hollow even in my own ears. The shrine world continued to shine. Above us, pilgrims still wept at altars, candles held aloft in trembling hands. They would never see this place. They would never smell what I smelled or feel the heat that never abated. They would never know how many hands had gone numb so their flames could burn steady. And I, down in the lower vats, began to understand that there was no bottom to this work, no point at which the ledger would be satisfied. No quota that meant rest. The labor was without end because the light was without end, and as I worked, hollow and unfeeling, I began to suspect that I was already being consumed, slowly, carefully, just like everything else that fed the flame. They announced the shortage the way all terrible things are announced in the Imperium, as a logistical concern. A notice appeared on the slate at the start of the cycle, stamped with overlapping seals and framed in devotional script so ornate it nearly hid the meaning. Tallow reserves below projected tolerance. Pilgrim influx sustained. Emergency sanctity measures authorized. The overseers read it aloud from the walkways, their voices echoing thinly through the steam. The priests followed, nodding gravely, as if the numbers themselves had confessed a sin. There was no panic in their tone. Panic implied loss of control. This was presented as opportunity. The faithful must give more of themselves. The senior priest declared, hands raised in blessing. In times of strain, true devotion reveals itself. I felt the words settle over us like a net. At first, the measures were small, blood tithers. We were lined up at the decay alcove, sleeves rolled up, wrists scrubbed raw with sanctifier. Needles slid into veins with practiced efficiency, drawing measured amounts into labeled vials. Each vial was weighed, logged, and praised. We were told the blood would be used in sacred oils, that it would strengthen the candle's sanctity. I watched my own blood darken the glass and felt nothing. Pain had long since lost its voice. The second measure came a cycle later, living tallow they called it. The phrase was wrapped in scripture and spoken softly, as if volume alone might make it obscene. The priests explained it patiently, like tutors addressing slow children. Excess fat could be harvested safely, they said. The body was resilient. The sacrifice would be temporary, the honor eternal. No one asked if it was voluntary. We were processed in batches, led into a side chamber I had never seen before, its walls tiled in white ceramite etched with litanies of offering. The air was cold there, deliberately so, a shock after the vat heat. I remember shivering as I was guided toward a metal slab bolted to the floor, its surface already stained despite the constant cleaning. Lie back, the medici servitor intoned, its voice flat and genderless. I obeyed. Restraints closed over my wrists, ankles, chest. Not tight enough to hurt, just enough to remind me that movement was not required. Above me, lumen globes hummed softly. I could hear hymns playing through hidden speakers, a gentle choir meant to soothe, to reframe what was happening as sacred rather than invasive. A priest stood at my side, hands clasped. You are honored, he said. Few are chosen to give so directly. I nodded because nodding was easier than thinking. The blade was cold. That I remember clearly. A precise instrument, sanctified, its edge engraved with scripture so small it looked like decoration. The first cut was shallow, almost polite. The second went deeper. I clenched my jaw as pressure replaced pain, a spreading heat beneath the skin as tissue was separated with methodical care. They worked efficiently, speaking in murmurs, calling out measurements to a scribe who recorded everything without looking at me. I felt tugging, a sense of something being removed that had always been part of me. My stomach twisted, not from pain but from a deeper violation, a knowledge that this too was being added to a ledger. Blood loss was monitored, fluids were replaced. The body, after all, was an asset, and assets were not wasted lightly. When they finished, the wound was sealed with a humming cauterizer, the smell sharp and unmistakable. Burnt flesh. Mine remained still, the servitor said. Recovery period minimal. They released me after an hour, wrapped my torso in binding cloth stiff with antiseptic, and handed me a revised ration chit that increased my allotment slightly. Compensation logged and approved. I returned to the lower vats that same cycle, moving carefully, aware of every shift in my balance. Others followed. Some cried. Some prayed aloud until their voices broke. A few had to be dragged to the slabs, their resistance framed as understandable weakness rather than dissent. The priest spoke gently to them, promising forgiveness for fear, praising eventual compliance. No one refused completely. The candles burned brighter for it. As shortages deepened, the measures escalated. Additional harvests were scheduled at regular intervals, the body treated like a renewable resource so long as it did not fail outright. I learned to recognize the signs of someone nearing depletion, the gray tinge to skin, the tremor in hands, the way their eyes struggled to focus. When someone collapsed, they were removed from the roster with quiet efficiency and added to intake logs under a different category. Faithful, even in failure, I lay on the slab more times than I can easily count. Each session stripped something from me, not just flesh, but whatever lingering sense of ownership I had over my body. I began to think of myself the way the overseers did as inventory. As yield, the hymns played on. Between harvests I worked, always worked. The bindings chafed under my uniform. Movements pulled at healing wounds until they reopened slightly, weeping into the fabric. I did not report it. Reporting led to adjustments, and adjustments led to further scrutiny. It was easier to endure. At night, when rest was granted, I would lie staring at the ceiling, counting my breaths. I no longer dreamed. My body needed all its resources to remain functional. Once a priest asked me how I felt. The question startled me so much I laughed, a dry, broken sound that echoed strangely in the chamber. He frowned, clearly uncertain how to record that response. "I feel useful," I said finally. He smiled, relieved, and noted it down. I realized then that there was nothing left they could take that would surprise me. My labor, my rest, my blood, my flesh, all of it had always belonged to the shrine world, to the light it demanded. The only thing I still possessed was awareness, and even that felt like a liability. When I returned to the slab for what I suspected would be another routine harvest, the restraints felt more familiar than my own bed had ever been. I closed my eyes as the hymns swelled, letting the words wash over me without meaning. I understood, at last, that this was what I had been born for. Not the vats, not the wicks, not even the endless labor. I was never meant to make the candles. I was meant to become one. I no longer go to the vats. That is how I know the process is complete. The reassignment notice came quietly, slipped onto my slate between quota updates and harvest schedules. Status change approved. Subject designated sustained resource. No ceremony, no priestly address. No final prayer offered on my behalf. The overseer did not even look at me when he nodded toward the side corridor and told me to follow the servitor. The corridor was clean, cleaner than anywhere I had been in years. White ceramite walls etched with flowing script, floors polished to a dull sheen that reflected my bare feet as I walked. The air was cool and dry, carefully regulated, carrying only the faintest trace of incense. This place was not meant for labor. It was meant for preservation. They led me into a chamber shaped like a chapel stripped of all ornamentation. No pews, no statues, just rows of metal frames set into the floor and walls, each one holding a body suspended in bindings of steel and leather. Tubes ran from those bodies into the walls, pulsing slowly with pale fluid. Some figures were unconscious. Some stared straight ahead with glassy eyes. A few turned their heads weakly as I was brought in, recognition flickering and dying as quickly as a guttering flame. I was guided to an empty frame. Compliance acknowledged. The servitor intuned. Begin integration. They laid me down gently, almost reverently. The bindings closed over my limbs and torso, not tight enough to hurt, not loose enough to allow movement. Cool metal pressed against skin already scarred and thinned by years of work and harvest. I felt strangely light, as if most of me had already been taken, and only the outline remained. The priest who attended this chamber spoke softly, as one might in a hospice. "You have served well," he said, making the sign of the aquila over my chest. "Now your service will be constant." Needles descended from articulated arms overhead, thinner than the auger needles of the harvest chamber, but more numerous. They slid into veins, into muscle, into places I no longer had names for. There was pain, but it was distant, muted by something already circulating through me. I felt warmth spreading, not heat, but a steady, artificial comfort. My blood flowed out in measured pulses, drawn through clear tubes where it was filtered and separated. I watched it move, darker at first, then lighter as components were stripped away. Fat followed, rendered carefully, never too much at once. The system was precise. It had learned my limits. "This will not kill you," the priest said, as if answering a question I no longer bothered to ask. "Your contribution will be ongoing." Above me, a lumen globe brightened slightly, responding to some unseen calibration. I felt a tug inside my chest, not physical but conceptual, as if a line had been drawn from me to something far away. The first candle lit with my substance burned somewhere else. I felt it, not pain, not pleasure. A sensation like pressure easing, like weight being redistributed. A small, steady drain, rhythmic and patient. I understood then that the system had always been leading here, every step a preparation. The vats, the wicks, the audits, the harvests, all of it refining me, thinning me until I was suitable. They fed me through tubes inserted at my throat and stomach, nutrient slurry calibrated to keep me alive but not strong. Strength was unnecessary now. Awareness was sufficient. Time changed shape. Cycles passed, but they were no longer marked by bells or shifts. They were marked by flow rates and collection intervals, by the quiet efficiency of servitors adjusting valves and recording yields. Sometimes a priest would come to speak prayers over us, praising our endurance, our constancy. Sometimes no one came at all. I learned the rhythm of the candles. Each burn pulled a little more from me, not enough to weaken me immediately, but enough that I felt thinner inside, hollowed. When a large festival approached somewhere beyond the shrine world, the pull intensified. I could feel dozens, hundreds of flames drawing at once, each one a small theft. The shrine world shone brilliantly. Pilgrims still came. I could hear them faintly through the walls sometimes, their chants muffled and distant. I imagined them kneeling before altars lit by candles made from me, their faces warm with faith. I wondered if any of them would feel the cost in the way I did, a faint, inexplicable chill beneath the glow. Probably not. My name, if it ever truly existed, has been gone for a long time. My work code still appears in the ledger, but only as a source designation now, a line item under sustained yield assets. I have become reliable, predictable, pure. Sometimes when the flow slows between collections, I am left alone with my thoughts. Those moments are dangerous. Memory tries to surface, images of hands stirring vats, of wicks braided under watchful eyes, of flames leaning just enough to damn me. I hold those memories carefully, knowing they will not last. The system does not require them. I confess now because confession is all I have left that resembles choice. Each word I form in my mind feels thinner than the last, as if even language is being rendered down, distilled into something more useful. I can feel myself diminishing, not in sudden loss but in steady attrition. One day, perhaps, there will not be enough left to sustain awareness, and I will be allowed to go dark. Until then, I burn, not all at once, not dramatically. I burn the way the Imperium prefers, slowly, efficiently, without waste. My substance becomes light in places I will never see, warming hands that will never know mine, illuminating prayers that will never include me. The shrine world shines. The ledgers balance. The faith endures. And I remain here, bound and emptied in careful measures, the candle that does not go out because it is never allowed to finish burning. This is my confession. It will last only as long as there is something left to take.